What's going on? Thanks for being here for our second lecture for Unit 2. Unit 2 is the biological basis of behavior, meaning how is everything we do tied to our biology, our physiology, our body, okay? In this particular lecture, we're going to be talking about neurons. I know this is a new word for some of you. You'll be an expert on neurons by the time we are through today, okay? So keep in mind, everything psychological is biological, meaning there's a biological explanation for everything. And a lot of the explanation, it's come back to neurons. So neurons are these tiny little cells in the body that make up the brain. I think this is a beautiful image here. The neurons spread out into a web throughout your brain, throughout your body. Here's another way of looking at a neuron. And here's another representation of neurons in action, okay? And how they connect to one another, okay? Neurons make you who you are. And so in our last lecture, we talked about the nervous system, right? We said the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. And then it's all these yellow nerves that are going out throughout the body to your hands and feet and arms and legs and chest. Any place that you can feel is because of the nervous system. It's because of your nerves. And you might not be able to see it over here, but this shows how the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system interweaves throughout the body to help your organs function properly, right? So we have your heartbeat being slowed down by the parasympathetic and accelerated by the sympathetic. We have your stomach. Digestion is slowed by the parasympathetic and sped up by the sympathetic. Your breathing, all the different parts of your body are controlled by the nervous system, and neurons help control the nervous system. Neurons are, this is the first thing I want you to write today. So Roman numeral 1, a little overview. Neurons are what make up nerve cells. And they are excitable, meaning they can change. The word we'll use is they fire. Okay, we'll talk about what that means. But they're the building block of the nervous system. Now there are three types of nerves, okay? The first type is called an afferent nerve. I would love it if you actually said afferent. Afferent with an A, okay? See us how we're making an A when we say afferent? The reason why I want you to say afferent and do this with your hands is because afferent nerves go from your feet and legs and chest and arms and fingertips. These nerves go up to the brain. Afferent. I do this by my brain because it lets me know, these are the signals and cells that connect from throughout my body up to the brain. Now the second type here is called an afferent cell. Whenever I say afferent, I do this with my hands because I'm demonstrating that efferent nerves start at the brain and they go out to the body. If afferent cells, it's your fingertips sending a message to the brain, ooh, this thing is hot. Efferent nerves from the brain let your fingertips know, well, move your hand. Contract those muscles. Afferent neurons up to the brain, afferent nerves out to the body, okay? The E in afferent reminds me of the E in the word exit, okay? So afferent nerves remind me of the E in exit because they exit the brain. The third type of nerve, easy to remember, interneurons. This root inter always means between. So interneurons communicate between the various nerves in the body, okay? I don't know, I'm going up to the computer to change it. I have a tablet right here. So we're actually gonna draw one neuron. And you have 100 billion neurons in your brain, but we're gonna draw one neuron, okay? So flip the page or get some copy paper or whatever you gotta do. Get some colored pencils and markers if you want. Pause me if you need to, but we're gonna draw a neuron, okay? So if I have my blank sheet of paper, the first thing I want you to do to draw your neuron is to draw sort of a little starburst, okay, with the sun in the middle of it. That's what it looks like. This is the first part of the neuron I want you to draw. It does not need to look neat and pretty. Mine does not, but just draw a little starburst with a nucleus in the middle. Spoiler alert, that's the nucleus. The next thing I want you to draw is just draw two parallel lines that make a long, skinny portion of the neuron. Easy, does not need to look good. And then draw a little spiky tail at the end. Voila, you have a beautiful neuron, okay? Here's a different representation of a neuron, okay? Yours does not need to look this good. Calm down, it's okay, right? But you have the sun part over here with the nucleus in the middle, and then you have the long, skinny portion here, and then you have the crinkly end all the way off to the right. The acronym that I use to remember the parts of the neuron is very appropriate for linear high school. It's CDAT, C-D-A-T, okay? So on your neuron, you don't need to write any of this just yet. We're going to go through it together, okay? On your neuron, we're going to label CDAT. So the first thing, the C, stands for the cell body. I mentioned in our last lecture that this root soma or somatic always refers to the body. So the cell body is the main part of a neuron. It's the blob, okay? So back in those pictures that I showed you earlier, you can see the somas really easily. It's the blobs, okay? That's the cell body. These gigantic blobs, that is the soma, okay? The D stands for the dendrites. Dendrites are the finger-like extensions from the soma that reach out, and it allows a neuron to receive messages, to get signals from other cells in the body. Dendrites receive. You'll hear me say that a lot in this unit. Dendrites receive. Okay? Once a dendrite has received a signal, it has to communicate that signal to the rest of the neuron. So the signal, and it's usually in the form of an electrical spark, an electrical signal, an electrical impulse, it travels down the wire, just as if I had a wire here in my classroom. Okay? The axon operates like a cord, like a wire. An electrical signal travels from the dendrites all the way down the axon. That's what the A is, right? So we have C, D, A to the very last part of the neuron, which is the terminal, the end of the neuron. Sometimes they're called the terminal buds, okay, B-U-D-S. So this stuff is bolded. I recommend that on your drawing you label C-D-A-T, okay? That's what a neuron is. It's a tiny little cell that has an electrical signal. It receives from the dendrites. The signal travels down the axon, and then it hits the terminal buds, okay? Now, a couple things that support the neuron in this action. So first, we have what's called glial cells. You will say glial. It's a fun word. Glial cells, it reminds me of the word glue. Glial cells hold the axon together. They hold the neuron together. They insulate and protect the neuron. They kind of look like marshmallows in some drawings. So like in this fancy drawing, if you look here, the axon is the blue wire. You can see these white, puffy, marshmallow-looking objects. That's the glial cells. The glial cells are made up of what's called myelin. So when I see the M in myelin, I think about nice, soft, cushy marshmallow protection for that axon, okay? These are the cells that make up your brain. So if you know someone who has Alzheimer's or dementia or has having memory problems, sometimes it's because what happens over time is the myelin, the marshmallows, this protective insulation that helps your brain work properly. Over time, the myelin, the glial cells, they kind of fall apart and our thinking gets slower over time. This is why. When I say everything psychological has a biological reason, that's what we're talking about in this unit, okay? There is a reason why our thinking slows down over time. The glial cells fall apart. Now, another word I need you to know is a synapse. Please put a star by the word synapse, circle it, highlight it. It's so interesting. The synapse is not actually part of a neuron. The synapse is the space between two neurons. So over here on the right, we have the terminal button of a neuron. There's a space, and then there's another neuron over here. So we have two neurons in this picture. The synapse is the space between the neurons. And if you could see closely, there's all these little chemicals that float from one neuron to the next. That's what happens in the synapse. That's where there's chemical transmission between neurons. It's how the neurons talk to each other, okay? So the synapse is the space between neurons. Let's look at another graphic here. There are a ton of neurons in this picture. This is a soma here. We have some terminals here, some dendrites. There's a soma there. There's a neuron over here. There's a neuron in the back that you can barely see. We have all these different neurons. And what I want you to focus on is how neurons never touch. There's a little bit of space between the dendrites and the terminal of various neurons. The synapses, this space, that's where the magic happens, okay? So, quick little check for understanding for you. Without looking down at your paper, can you label A, B, C, D, E, F? A, B, C, D, E, F. You should be able to label these different parts of the neuron, and we'll go over this together in class on Tuesday or Wednesday. Another check for understanding. What are the 3 types of nerve cells? You should be able to answer this without looking at your notes. You might need to do that for our test in a few weeks, okay? What part of a neuron does the action potential travel down? So what's the long wiry part of the neuron called? Which part of the neuron receives signals? And what is a synapse? You should be able to answer these questions without looking at your notes, okay? The 4th Roman numeral, the last section of today's notes, actually, for real this time, it's about how neurons fire, okay? I told you, neurons are excitable. They do something, they change. And when a neuron fires, we call it an action potential. There's action, there's movement, there's a difference. I mentioned that a neuron firing is an electrical impulse. It's an electrical signal. And if we want to get technical, they don't usually ask about this, but if you've taken AP Bio, you might know about how ATP, the sodium potassium pumps work. That's how neurons work as well. There are sodium potassium ions, meaning these charged cells that quickly move in and out of the neurons. So neurons are usually, they have a negative charge, right? A lot of electrons, negative charge, negative 70 millivolts. And when a neuron gets a special signal, when it gets excited, ions rush in, and that neuron moves from a negative charge to a positive charge. We could graph a neuron's charge, right? I want you to imagine that, like, I could put a voltmeter inside one of these tiny little bitty cells in your brain, okay? And normally when the cell's resting, it's at negative. And when a neuron gets a signal, when it gets a message, when it receives chemicals from other neurons, the neuron fires, and a positive charge runs down the axon, and that's how the neuron communicates to its buddies, right? So in just a single millisecond, this neuron fires, and then it has to kind of recharge. So that's what happens when a neuron gets excited, when it gets a message, it fires. It's a little electrical spark inside of your brain. Okay? Think of each neuron as being like a cannon. Okay, I know this is kind of hard to see, but right here you have a neuron's resting potential, when a neuron is just chilling in your brain. An action potential is when the neuron activates and fires. And then there's what's called a refractory period. Neurons can't fire back to back without resting and recovering. That rest recovery period is called the refractory period. It all means the same thing. Rest, recovery, refractory, reloading period for that neuron. So like you have a neuron in your brain that is associated with sushi. You have a sushi neuron in your brain. And all day long, probably, your sushi neuron has just been resting. It's just been chilling at negative 70 millivolts, not worrying about anything at all, just chilling. And when I said the word sushi, that cell in your brain got excited. Your ears heard the word, a message went to your brain, and that cell got so excited that it released a bunch of ions and it fired. That's how neurons work, okay? And then I bet some of the other neurons fired. Your hunger neurons fired, and your salivation neurons fired, and your Mori house, or whatever your favorite kind of sushi is, your public sushi neurons. Neurons are all connected to each other. When one neuron fires, other neuron fires, and that's why you are who you are, okay? So neurons are usually resting. We call that resting potential. They're negative. Negative 70 millivolts usually when they're just chilling. Negative 70 millivolts. And then when they get excited, they fire. So something like positive 30 millivolts, okay? And then they have to have a little bit of rest before they can fire again, okay? It's called the refractory period or the recovery period. So test yourself, okay? Here's a graph of a neuron. Number one, at which of these letters is the neuron resting? Well, it's resting at, it could be more than one. It's resting at A and D. That's just a neuron not doing anything, not activated, not excited, not firing. Number two, when is the neuron firing? When is it experiencing action potential? Well, B represents the action potential. Number three, when is the neuron recovering? C represents the recovery period of a neuron, okay? Here's another way of looking at it. This is a neuron that almost fired but didn't. Neurons can't half fire. Either they fire or they don't. Now, once a neuron gets enough activity, it'll completely fire, meaning it'll depolarize, it'll become positive, and then it dips back down or becomes super negative because it has to recover and recharge. And once it gets back to its baseline, once it gets back to negative 70, it is ready to fire again. Oh, this is the brain of a little worm, and each of those little red sparks represents a neuron firing. In your brain, you have 100 billion neurons, and they fire on average 200 times a second. And then each of your neurons is connected to 1,000 other neurons. I don't even know what this number is, but that's how much information is being transmitted in your brain every second by these tiny little magical cells that are constantly releasing chemicals into a synapse, receiving chemicals through their dendrites, and having a little electrical impulse slide down the axon. That's why you are the way you are. All day long, your entire life, 100 billion neurons, 200 times a second, making 1,000 other neurons fire. That's why you are the way you are. That's why you do what you do. Everything psychological is simultaneously biological. Now, Mr. Jones, why is there a toilet on the board? Well, neurons are kind of like toilets, okay? What I want you to do is think to yourself, we'll talk about this in class, but what about a toilet represents the fact that neurons also have a refractory period? There's a term threshold about how neurons have a threshold before they'll fire. Well, toilets have a threshold. There's an all or none principle for neurons and toilets. There's a direction of impulse principle for neurons and toilets. Toilets have an action potential and a resting potential. Toilets have glial cells. I want you to think about how toilets might represent neurons. We're going to talk about that in class, but this is basically your brain. It's many, many neurons together. Think about it. Let me know, email me if you have questions. We will have a quiz over this lecture and the Unit 2 Day 1 lecture, so make sure that you are ready for that. Thanks, y'all.